The US and China are on the brink of a new Cold War that could devastate the global economy. This article by Business Insider says, quote, "The relationship between the US and China was already teetering close to the edge of a cliff before COVID-19, but the pandemic pushed it right off. The dynamic between Beijing and Washington has become so contentious in the coronavirus era that China experts now say the two major powers have stumbled into the early days of a new Cold War that could prolong the pandemic, exacerbate the economic devastation linked to the virus, and weaken the world's ability to thwart common threats." Orville Schell, the director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society, told Insider, "We're essentially in the beginnings of a Cold War. We are on a downward slide into something increasingly adversarial with China." Schell added, "The consequences of the breakdown in U.S.-China relations is going to be very grave for the world and for the global economy because the ability of the U.S. and China to work together was the keystone of the whole arc of globalization and global trade. With that pulled out, there's going to be a tremendous amount of disturbance." The article continues, "The Cold War analogy is not perfect, but there are elements including the hardening of system-type competition, ratcheting up of military competition, and pressure to de-link economically that were not as evident a few years ago." The director for Asia Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations told Insider, quote, "The reality is that tensions between the United States and China are rising considerably at the moment. I know people get uncomfortable with the terminology, but I do think we have to be honest and call this what it is, and this is the start of a new Cold War. And if we're not careful, things could get much, much worse." Business Insider and a lot of other media outlets have been really running with this US-China Cold War story for a couple of weeks now. And I want to kind of try to unpack this a little bit because it's kind of a complicated situation. To do so, first, let's consider China's economic growth over the last 4 decades, right? So starting in 1978, China induced some economic reforms that really took it away from its traditional state control of assets, and they did so in 3 ways. First, they encouraged the privatization of businesses. They allowed people to go out and become entrepreneurs and create their own businesses, especially in the countryside. Second, they liberalized their economy. And what's this mean? So they liberalized it in terms of foreign investment, which means that they allowed multinational companies to come in and actually invest their businesses in China, create manufacturing, and create home bases in the country. And the third thing they did, and this is probably the most important, is that they really invested in manufacturing and they invested in the education of their workforce. These reforms had really significant economic impact, and really quickly too. In the years following 1978, China's GDP went up from 3 to 6% on average to 9 and 13% on average. In the 15 years that followed, Chinese per capita income quadrupled. And going into the 80s and 90s, you see a lot of urbanization, an economic boom from all that manufacturing, really similar to what happened in the United States during their Industrial Revolution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. China has become an international manufacturing hub. And this strengthens China directly through its economic strength, but indirectly it also serves as a means for political leverage. Think about it. This is why in 2018, when Donald Trump was in the middle of his trade war with China, he was having private meetings with big corporate CEOs like Tim Cook, who have a huge interest in China and whose billion-dollar companies could be affected by US foreign policy in China. But I think the real source of tension with China isn't that their economy has grown to the second largest in the world. I think the real source of tension is that China's actually finally looking to exert their influence beyond their own borders. Specifically, they're doing this with the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative is President Xi Jinping's brainchild, and basically it's his vision for creating a network of railways, energy pipelines, and streamlined border entries into Asia, the Middle East, and south into Africa too. The main goal here is to expand networks of commerce for China, but a lot of critics are calling it a new form of colonialism. Basically, China is loaning smaller nations money for the infrastructure that they need. They then take this money and pay Chinese contracting firms to come in and build the infrastructure that China can use later on. But what happens when these countries can't pay? Do they now become satellite nations of the CCP? In this case, China is using soft tactics to get their foot in the door with these countries. They're promising infrastructure and increased trade networks, which will lead to higher quality of life. But what's happening as a byproduct is Chinese dominance and influence in the region. Thucydides' trap says that when one power looks to displace another, war is inevitable. And is that the situation that the US and China find itself in? I'd have to say that honestly I don't think so. From what I've read about China while researching this, it seems like Beijing is a lot more concerned with regional stability than world domination. And that's to say that they're more concerned with the affairs of their neighbors and what's going on in their backyard than actually really upsetting the geopolitical hegemony. With the Soviet Union and the United States, there was an arms race, and there was a clear ideological battle whereby the US and the Soviet Union were trying to bring in peripheral nations and exert their influence to bring them onto their side. The Chinese military, while they have huge numbers as far as reserves and active members, and they have a huge land arsenal, has a really lackluster navy. And without a navy that can protect outside of the South China Sea, which is where they're really being aggressive lately, they can't really challenge the US globally. China is definitely a rising power, and a stronger Chinese influence in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa would definitely upset the current world hegemony. But is it the right of the United States to stop that from happening? I wonder. Why do we have to play world police? China isn't looking to invade the United States, and on paper, their whole infrastructure plan is really just to boost trade and to secure its borders and to secure stability in their area. And I'll leave you with that. What are your thoughts? Comment below. Let me know what you think about China and the US and how this potential Cold War situation might play out. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for taking the time out to watch.